Hello everyone, this is part one of our look at Winslow Homer, a very great famous American artist, and again very interesting because he comes from that period right after the Civil War leading up to about 1900, this kind of area where we have a lot of change that occurs in what we think of how Americans kind of view themselves and also view art. This is of course his most famous painting. When we look at his past, he was born in 1836 in Boston. He was taught to draw and kind of the fundamentals of art, if you will, by his mother at an early age. At the age of 19, he becomes an apprentice to a lithographer, and this is kind of where he really starts to understand the ideas of printmaking. And again, at the age of 21, very early in his life, he starts to work for Harper's Weekly, and this is very kind of traditional role for a lot of American artists to work in print and then work their way forward. His most famous painting, of course, is issued as a stamp in 1962, and I've said you can always tell you're a famous artist when you actually get a stamp of some of your work. But again, when we look at him and the legacy of American art, he kind of forms an interesting place. Again, mostly self-taught as an individual artist. As we can see here, he records for Harper's Weekly the Civil War between 1861 and 1865, and this is him traveling with the Army of the Potomac and actually doing sketches and that type of thing. Immediately following that, from 67 to 68, he spends a little bit of time in Paris and actually shows one of his more famous paintings at the very, very famous Universal Exposition. You can really have two different lectures altogether on Winslow Homer's work, one just based on the work that he did for Harper's Weekly. And again, when we look at this and you can see he's really a master at the idea of printmaking as well. And again, a lot of these kind of drawings fed into this. We also know that he had a workshop. But again, he's working and he's very successful even early on in his life, kind of manufacturing these images. And again, we have one there on the right and in detail just to show how well he was able to do kind of these details within the printmaking dynamic. And again, a lot of this carries forward to his other work that we see, his oil painting and then eventually his watercolor. And again, when we look at this, he learned to draw and then he did printmaking and then he did oil and then he did watercolor, which is kind of a reversal. Most people know how to draw, then they'll do watercolor, oil painting, and then eventually move on to printmaking. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year is just a wonderful image to show the complexity of what he's attaining here in terms of the work. Again, we have this whole homage of different children doing different things within this kind of Christmas ball, if you will, getting the sensation of depth, but also the idea of breaking it up into separate areas. A little bit darker of an image. Again, this is from the Army of the Potomac, and as I mentioned, he did travel with this army, and this is a very hazardous occupation, not only for the idea that you might get wounded by way of the actual battle, but we also have things like disease that are very, very rampant in these larger encampments that we have of soldiers at the time. Hygiene wasn't the best. So around 1865, we start to see his first paintings, and what happens is in 1859 he moves to New York, and then in 1863 he attends the National Academy of Design there in New York City to learn how to paint. And this is he works there for about a year, and really just from that year, we actually see him moving forward. And as I mentioned, these croquet players is one of his earliest scenes we see again and again. But then we move to things like The Veteran in a New Field. And again, this is the idea of the soldier going back and working in the field rather than being a soldier. And again, his back is turned to us. We obviously get this idea of the reaper. And again, this is a veteran, but when you look at the age of the individual, very, very young, and the idea of wheat being this abundant thing from the north. Prisoners from the Front is probably his most famous early work that we have, and what we have here is three different soldiers of the Confederacy, and each one of them kind of has a different outlook on life. We have everything from the humble to the confused to the overly proud, and again, this is the painting that was shown in the Universal Exhibition in Paris, and again, really gives him some renown. The gentleman in the painting, I believe, is Albert Post. We have this portrait of Albert Post from around the same time, and when you look at the two, we do see a sort of likeness. I don't know 100% for sure if the previous image was Albert Post, but it's a good guess that it was. We also know that this is a distant cousin of Winslow Homer, so we do have a family connection to this as well. But again, a lot of this is left over from his time with the Potomac. Winslow Homer also shows African Americans, and he's, in my opinion, one of the first African American or painters of African Americans post Civil War to really show the population with a sense of dignity. And again, when we look at this, it's not a caricature or anything of that nature. This is just a regular painting of people working in a field, a very common theme that we see with Winslow Homer. Another very common theme we'll see is, of course, the ocean and the beach, as we see from 1869. Very nicely balanced composition. We have a group of ladies there on the left and that wonderful cresting wave there on the right to kind of balance out what's occurring. But again, this is a lot of what we'll see from his work, and we do need to remember that in the early part of the country, that's a lot of what the country is. On the Bridle Path from 1868, a nice double entendre here, not only the bridle in the sense of the horse, but bridle perhaps in the sense of the woman. We'll notice that she is wearing all white, and we know that she's traveling in some direction, so you can kind of make your own inferences into this. But again, a very beautiful painting, and we can see very early on he shows a phenomenal talent for painting. And these are the images that I particularly enjoy. These images where he goes back to where the Army of the Potomac was and kind of goes back through these areas of civilization and really captures what early America looks like. We have the famous country schoolhouse with every age of children imaginable, and one poor woman there to teach every single one of them, no matter what the age. And then outside of the little red schoolhouse, of course, we have Snap the Whip. An interesting thing, of course, to observe is that few of these children actually have shoes on. But this is a statement of the time, and again, a wonderful composition, and it's wonderful to see how well Homer does all of these things, like this row of flowers in the front that kind of mimics these young gentlemen playing Snap the Whip. But again, the harbor and the effects of light and on the water itself is really what we look at from Homer. And as I mentioned, he learns to paint oils, but then he actually shifts over to watercolors. And he is probably one of the most renowned watercolor artists in the world throughout history. Again, when we look at different artists and their use of watercolor, Winslow Homer kind of rises to the cream of the crop, if you will. From 1873, we have Dad's Coming! Exclamation point. I tried to sound excited there. And again, this is almost like one of these Norman Rockwell scenes where we have the family looking and waiting for the father with all of these boats, and you can tell by the mother's face they don't exactly see them, the father. And we get into this whole narrative, of course, about sailing and that type of thing. One of the things we definitely get from Winslow Homer is this kind of image of the American woman. And again, in the majority of these, it's interesting because he chooses activity as this key point. And when we look at this, we have Fresh Eggs from 1874, and another version of The Red Schoolhouse from 1873. In both of these, we have these women who look a little bit older, but again, both of them engaged in activity. In 1875, he commits commercial work, quits doing commercial work altogether to focus on painting. We return to Breezing Up or A Fair Wind, of course, his more famous of images. And this, when we look at the rest of his career, he goes through a little bit of financial hardship, a little bit reliant on his family, like most artists are at one point, and eventually, later on, he will eventually reach financial success within his own lifetime. Moonlight from 1874, just a nice, simplistic, nice romantic scene. We can, of course, tell by the silhouettes that this is a man and a female looking off at a beautiful moonlight over the water. And again, we're getting into this body of work that's watercolors, and it is, of course, absolutely amazing when we look at this and see what he's able to do. Two more images of women from this time period. Peeling a lemon, again, this is more of a middle class type of woman, but even in this, we'll notice that she's doing something, even if it's as simple as peeling a lemon. And then we have Blackboard from 1877. We have a woman either giving instruction or learning, if you will. And again, that's a watercolor, a very, very beautiful use of tone. As I mentioned earlier, Winslow Homer does look at the African American population. Dressing for the Carnival is a beautiful example of this from 1877. We have this gentleman dressing up as an aspect of the carnival, and we have to think about this transition that's occurring between the African American population being slaves and now being free, and kind of making this transition between those two cultures, and that's what a lot of that painting is about. A new novel, again, we have this idea of the middle class woman laying in the wonderful shade of a tree enjoying a new book, and again, we can't quite tell if she's reading or if perhaps she's dozed off while she was thumbing through the pages, as many of us are off to do when we're in the middle of a very, very good book. A few more images of women. The Milkmaid from 1878 and Fresh Air from the same year. Again, very, very rural kind of imagery, and this is something that we really do see with a lot of his paintings of women, is these are farm girls or shepherd women, if you will, rather than a lot of middle class women. Again, I think he's interested in exploring more this idea of what people are doing in the country in more of the rural setting. The Green Hill from 1878, an absolutely beautiful painting, kind of bringing all of this together. And again, the woman almost seems a secondary thought, looking off as we are into this beautiful, beautiful green hill, lush. And to me, that's more what this painting is about, is actually that green hill than this woman in proximity. And that's true also with the girl with a hay rake. We have this young lady who's so far off that we can't even tell all of her details, but she just seems so at home within the framework of what we see. And all of these wonderful little splotches of color that Homer puts into the composition, these light blues that you can see that almost look like butterflies flying through the field on the style. Again, this kind of rural setting with these two kind of jumping over a fence and heading off who knows where to do who knows what. But again, really this wonderful focus again on just more of the rural community that we have in America at the time. And again, this is kind of the power of Homer, Winslow Homer, is when we look at these paintings, we really do get that wonderful glimpse into that side of America. Sunset Fires is a wonderful example of this watercolor technique that he's fostering. And again, you can actually kind of feel the presence of the paper underneath with all of these very, very thin washes that he's actually putting on the surface. Again, we return to this kind of nautical theme, and this is appropriate. Right around this time, we actually do have Homer traveling to England between 1881 and 1882, very, very short period, and he stays on the coast and observing a lot of the same type of imagery that we would associate with his time in America. A lot of these fisher women, if you will, doing things like mending nets, very, very simple compositions like this one, showing light and also these simple activities. And again, this type of imagery reflecting the coast of England. But again, very, very similar to the images that we saw him doing in America. Again, this idea of the working woman of the lower middle class and her setting and where she would actually be working. In this case, directly on the coast. You can see the baskets and the nets and a reminder of the ships off in the distance. Another very beautiful image from 1882, girl carrying a basket. Beautiful division of the canvas, almost in a diagonal, and this very, very wonderful little boat down on the bottom just to balance out our young lady as she's going down the hill holding this wonderful basket. Again, a very middle class type of feeling from the painting.